following fireside chat, our guests will debunk the widespread idea that technology is complicated and overwhelming. We will talk about the three major pillars in today's market through the lenses of technology: customer experience, staff experience, and sustainability. We will also hear how companies can use technology to get the best out of it.
Today's speakers are Alex Rabarts. We were kind of trying to pronounce the name earlier with Alex, so apologies again if I'm pronouncing it wrongly. He is the co-founder and Innovation and Technology Director of TechSpace, our host today. Before co-founding TechSpace, Alex's career spanned software engineering, user experience, and product management. Today, he focuses on bringing the benefits of technology to the flex office sector as he endeavors the support change-making TechSpace members across Europe. Our second speaker is Adam Blaskey, founder and chief vision officer of Productive. He has been a FlexSpace pioneer since 2012. Now he advises owners and operators in fusing the physical and digital worlds to make sure workflows, processes, and technology support the customer journey. Please welcome on stage, and we're looking forward to hear the chat you have prepared for us.
So I think we're going to change the title after that introduction. So it's now called Data as a Superpower. So forget what you came for, it's Data as a Superpower. And the reason we're talking about data as a superpower is, having been in the industry for some time and certainly having got to know Alex pretty well, using that data is critical to enable a better flexible workspace experience. So what we're going to try and do today is demystify some of this a little bit and put it into ways that hopefully many of you that come from a real estate background can better understand. So we're going to look at it through several lenses. The first, of course, is member experience. How can we better align technology and processes to deliver the best customer journey and the best possible member experience? Then looking at it from an operational perspective and a staff experience. You know, how can we use data and insight to enable teams to be much more productive in providing those services that members need? Then we're going to look more in detail about space as a service, because that's the industry that we're in, and it should be much more around the physical space that we provide people. It's not just desks and chairs, but particularly because of the challenge we just heard about, is really, you know, strengthening that relationship between operator and occupier in terms of giving them the insight into how their physical space is being used. We'll look at how we can use data and insight to enhance revenue, particularly secondary revenue streams, whether that's meeting rooms, desks, or other services. And finally, from a sustainability and well-being perspective, what technologies are out there that can really make places much more sustainable and support the well-being of those that occupy them. So to kick off with, as we're at Alex's home at TechSpace, how's TechSpace different to many flex operators, do you think?
Yeah, so we say that TechSpace is where change makers are made. So what that really means is that we service a specific segment, which is innovative technology businesses. So the way that we deliver that and the way that we're different is a lot of that is around the community. You know, kind of the events that we offer. We put on learning and development programs specifically for roles within tech businesses. And then also we go a bit further beyond that and we deal with things like enterprise IT. So we offer enterprise IT as a service. But really the focus is around looking at a very specific target customer segments and then focusing on our services and offering around that.
And so how's your approach to providing that technology, and certainly the technology that you use to run the business? How's that evolved over time?
Yeah, so we've actually been around for quite a long time. And when we started, there weren't really any platforms like Office R&D available, but clearly having a platform to run your business from is very important. So because I came from a technology background myself, we started to build that technology ourselves. Now the problem with that is you'll appreciate that the scope of a product like Office R&D is vast. So for us as an operator, that quickly became unsustainable to grow the features and to manage it. Fortunately, as the industry developed, we found that operators like Office R&D came up, and that really allowed us to outsource that and buy that software in. And then we changed focus internally and we started looking at integrations and becoming a systems integrator. And I think that's really key to So what we found is important to driving efficiency is making sure that all of your platforms are integrated and your data is flowing across all those platforms.
And using those kind of best-in-breed technologies that are out there.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, and again, coming from a sort of systems integration point of view, we found that over the years, the systems we've used have changed substantially. So we found we've swapped in some systems for others, sometimes as the technologies develop, sometimes as our business has grown and we've outgrown the needs of more simple software. So that the ability to kind of like chop and change and keep those integrations running smoothly has been really key for us. Yeah.
Okay. And so bring it back, to the lens that we just talked about in terms of member experience. How have you used technology to really enhance and support the member experience of your customers?
Yeah, so the way we approach this is by we think about just keeping technology out of the way. So technology is not just the stuff that the members interact with, like your app or your meeting room signage, whatever it is. It's also everything else that goes on behind the scenes. So and the way the objective is really to create a frictionless in-building and online experience. It's all about making everything frictionless. So a couple of examples around that would be things like access control. So when we onboard a new member through Office R&D, that data is automatically pushed over to our access control system, and that means they automatically get access to the building. And then recent developments in things like access control mean that you don't even need a card these days. You can now just have those credentials on your phone, and that can just even be in your pocket. And that can be a really, really smooth experience. And then you've got other things like building management systems, which is a whole kind of complex topic. But I think a lot of people sort of think about building management systems as being this complex control panel that maybe sits in your facilities office or in your plant room. But the reality is that there are lots of new, really exciting technologies going on around that mean that you can connect those systems to the internet, and you can start closing the feedback loop by using things like sensor platforms. So then you can start doing things like measuring CO2 levels and then saying when those levels rise, you're turning on the fresh air system. Or when the sun comes out, we're dropping down the blinds. So closing that feedback loop and using the intelligence of those platforms to drive member experiences is very, very doable in this day and age.
And we'll come back to those points about sustainability and so on. I never thought I'd get so excited about access control, but it's one of those things that, in running buildings and designing buildings used to be an afterthought. But really, it's the first thing that we need to think about. If we're thinking about it from an experience point of view and a customer journey, it's how we get in the building in the first place. Yeah. Not only the data we can get from that now, which is fundamentally important, but the integrations that Office R&D have done with various access control platforms means that it can be seamless from day one. It can be a productivity tool, it can be a time-saving tool because it means we don't have to set up access control on a different system. It can mean that if somebody doesn't pay you, they don't get in. If their contract's expired, it takes them off the system. But there are some really neat ways now to use access control. And one of the things that I hear kind of time and time again from operators is how engagement with apps is quite low. And it's one of the easiest ways to boost engagement with your membership base because if they have to use your app to access the building, well, that's the best way that they're going to interact with it, book meeting rooms and so on and so forth. Yeah. So on, just mentioned meeting rooms, in terms of driving technology, driving secondary revenues with technology. Yeah. Have you got some examples of how you've done that?
Yeah, so I guess I've got sort of pre and post pandemic examples. So we've been, for quite a long time, I mentioned we're delivering enterprise IT as a service. So that's really important for our customers particularly because they're technology businesses, they have quite demanding requirements around IT. So for us to be able to deliver things like virtualized firewalls or complex routing out to the internet or large amounts of bandwidth, historically that's been the sort of thing that we've focused on. And that's a secondary revenue stream for us. But I think going forwards, what's actually more interesting is looking at how, as people use their space more flexibly, so by that I mean, for example, we're seeing our customers reduce their space by probably about half of what they used to use, but still with the same number of people. So those people will be coming in on some days. So we'll see surge days where we see more activity, some days where there's less activity. And what that is really driving is flexible spaces within our buildings. So rather than just the private offices that we've historically sold, we're now allocating more and more space to occasional and overspill and on-demand spaces. So that would be like meeting pods, hot desking areas, meeting rooms, event spaces. And I think that's going to be a key driver of secondary revenues because companies want to use this on demand. I mean, some will want to be buying bundles so they can get kind of discount pricing. So they may be running an all hands event, once a month in a space like this and kind of lock that in. But then there are going to be other surge days where unexpectedly more people come in and then they suddenly need a hot desking space. So the two key takeaways for us is that that's a key area to understand the data and understand the usage patterns. And secondly, we need a platform to manage that. So having the ability to on demand book that, to invoice that, or even take payments at the point of sale if it's not a resident member. So that's all really important.
So if we can just touch on for a minute some of the stuff that we're doing together, that we're helping TechSpace with. And we are piloting various things together using IoT sensors in office space, in meeting rooms, in breakout areas, and looking at that data alongside what we can get from office R&D. Do you just want to share some of the use cases that we're...
Yeah, so I think, I guess a couple of examples. So one would be around revenue protection or identification of revenue leakage. So we're looking at the data around actual usage of our meeting rooms versus the booking data. So that's going to be a classic one where you see people, camping in a meeting room or whatever. So just understanding that differential there, I think is quite important. And then
we're looking, if just interject, we're looking at it from two angles, not just how often a space is being used, how many hours a meeting room is being used, but actually how many people are in those rooms. Because most of the time we design rooms for 6, 8, 10, 12, 20, and unless we monumentally mess up, we'll probably do the same thing in the next building and the next building. But we're actually using this data to be much more objective. Gut instinct, of course, is important, but looking at not just, has somebody booked the room or not, or maybe they booked it for an hour and they've stayed for 2 or 3 hours, but how many people are in those rooms? So really, in terms of revenue protection, we can cut that off as much as we can.
Yeah, and then the flip side of that is driving design decisions. So that might be, as you say, the design of our meeting room suites, but we're also looking at on a much more granular level, so that when we have new customers come in, we're using that data from the sensors and our in-house design expertise to run a design consultancy process with the new customer, because everyone's using their space in a different way now. Not each company will have slightly different working patterns. Hybrid is the catch-all that all of our customers are using, that everyone's working in hybrid patterns. But what does hybrid actually mean for each individual customer is different. So we're using data and insights to learn about how our customers use their space and then to adapt that and help them to create the most optimal space.
And we've only just kind of touched on the kind of fragmented tech stack that workspace operators use, but why do you think the tech stack is so fragmented?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, the scope of technology within a business like this is really broad. So if you think you've got everything, from finance invoicing to access control, CCTV, you've got BMSs. There's the technology, the IT infrastructure, the Wi-Fi. There are so many systems. The breadth of that is so broad that you couldn't possibly have one vendor that delivers it all. And then within those vendors, they're all competing and evolving their products. So at any one point in time, one vendor might be ahead of the others, and you might want to select the best vendor at that point in time. Then you've got the length of time that these systems hang around. So typically, when you build out a building, you're thinking from a technology point of view, you're thinking from sort of 5 to 15 years in terms of how long this technology is going to be hanging around. So that means you have to deal with legacy systems. So this kind of breadth of systems and then the variety within that breadth means that you just can't possibly have one vendor that's dealing with it. So again, for us, it comes back to that point of integration. We really need to be able to draw the data down and share that data across all of our different systems to create an efficient overall system.
And once you've got that data, what do you do with that? I mean, how do you use that to improve your efficiency, to improve the product, reduce risk? What do you use with the data and the insight that you can get from it?
Well, yeah, so I mean, we use it in a whole bunch of different ways depending on the different teams. But I think for me, the key has been, because of this breadth of systems that you end up with, one of the problems that we've faced in the past is internally for our staff, that becomes quite difficult to reconcile, to handle. So one approach we've really gone for is to try to minimize the number of kind of home systems that each team uses. So rather than having, the finance team logging into Salesforce, for example, we focus them in on just their finance core system, plus maybe some reporting that pulls in some Salesforce data, for example. Our community team really focus on, obviously they're using Office R&D for the sort of day-to-day management, and then they have a communication platform that they're using to communicate with customers. And then we have our IT team, they're very focused on ticketing, so they're SaaS and Jira. So we're really kind of like narrowing down the scope of the number of systems each team is using, but then making sure that the data is flowing across all of those different systems.
And is that data and insight, is that more important than ever before, or is it something that's always been front of mind?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think again, like I said earlier, I think the reason why that data is becoming more important is because hybrid is driving flexible use of the space, and that's driving more intensive use of the space. So being able to manage that is really important. If we've got the same number of people, but in half the dedicated office space, and much more use of the overspill spaces, that's the pattern we're seeing. That means that things like fire risk management become much more difficult to manage. So using the data to manage occupancy, for example, is really important. And as we said before, from a design point of view, understanding how people are using those spaces more intensively, that becomes really important.
So I think that's particularly fascinating because as a sector, we haven't had to innovate for hundreds of years. And then obviously COVID being the huge change for this. But now we're being forced to really understand in so much greater detail how our buildings, how our spaces are being used to provide the space as a service solutions that people are needing. And I think it's a super exciting time for our sector, and particularly the kind of prop tech sector as a whole. And adoption has been slow for some time. Personally, I think that's because a lot of companies have been trying to sell the features of their products and platforms rather than the benefits that most people in real estate actually understand. Yeah. Because I think most operators in our sector have come from a real estate background, or they've had a vision for some kind of building and haven't really understood that the technology's out there. And now, hopefully, what we're trying to do today is kind of break it down into tangible ways of how that data's being used. Yeah. One thing that we haven't yet mentioned is sustainability and well-being. What are you doing around sustainability and well-being?
Well, actually, I thought this might be a good one for you thoughts, actually. So obviously we've been working on our. We're doing a new building at the moment. We're looking at the BMS and how we can apply an EIP on top of that. So maybe that would be something interesting for you to talk about. Yeah.
Was part of the pilot that we're doing here at TechSpace, alongside occupancy and utilization, we're putting environmental sensors into spaces as well to look at temperature, humidity, and particularly CO2 levels. Temperature and humidity are kind of basic because if it's about providing the best possible experience, we've got to make sure that people are not too hot, not too cold, and make sure that we can do something about that before somebody comes to the front desk and complains, or they want a refund on their meeting or whatever. But particularly the CO2 levels are quite interesting for me because there's a lot of research out there that shows that high CO2 levels are actually detrimental to our cognitive performance. So if people are coming to use our spaces, particularly meeting rooms for breakout days, because teams need to come together in a different way than they came together before, then in terms of providing space as a service, managing, monitoring, and doing something about high CO2 levels is important. And you would all have experienced that. If you've ever been in a poorly ventilated meeting room, after a few hours, you kind of start to doze off after a while, and that's purely because there's not enough fresh air in that room. So we can actually do something about that with some relatively inexpensive technology. And then taking that a step forward in creating basic smart building solutions, it means that if those levels are dropping, then the BMS kicks in, or the air conditioning system switches on and puts more fresh air in the room. So it's not that complicated when you understand what we're trying to do in terms of providing those solutions. And then from an environmental perspective, it goes without saying that, you know, if rooms are unoccupied, then should the lights, the aircon be on 24/7? There's lots of people posting pictures on LinkedIn of empty buildings with lights on, and simply connecting the sensors up to booking management systems to your BMS allows you to do
and I think having the insights and the data around that as well is really, really important, especially around energy. I mean, in the current energy climate, that's going to be super important to understand where your energy is going. So not just using the feedback loop from the sensors, but maybe where you haven't got the feedback loop, understanding the data, and that's what energy intelligence platforms that can sit on top of your BMS can provide.
And that energy intelligence is a real competitive advantage. I'm not sure, how long have we got, by the way? We're running out of time. We've got a few more minutes, 5 minutes? Okay. So we've got time to actually dwell on this point, because I think it's a real point of advantage that forward-thinking operators can take on board. As more and more people kind of set out their net zero goals, as more and more occupiers go for B Corp status and things like that, knowledge around energy consumption of buildings, which account for about 30% of all global CO2 emissions, is going to become that much more important. And particularly when it comes to understanding scope emissions. So a few of you have heard me talk about this before, but I think it's an area in the industry that not many people really understand that well. So if you're trying to reduce your energy emissions, if you're trying to hit a net zero target, it's about understanding scope emissions. And they're broken down into 3 scopes. Scope 1 is, how do I control my energy, which is simply turning lights off. Scope 2 is, where's my energy coming from? So is it from renewable sources? Maybe I have a ground source heat pump, or it's coming from various renewable sources. But the third is also, where is the energy in my value chain? Where is the energy being used in my supply chain? And then if we're providing office space to people, then they're going to come back to us in return and say, give me the energy usage of that building. Yeah. And put quite simply, it doesn't matter how good your brand is, how good your building is. If you can't provide them with that information, they'll probably go to a building where somebody
I think this is really important as Flex enters more and more the corporate real estate world. You know, as Flex becomes part of corporate real estate strategies, that point is going to become more and more important.
And so with increasing kind of technology, with increasing needs for data, and it can be, fairly siloed. Like, we only know what we know. We row our own lane. Finance has very different demands from operational and so on. What kind of things are you doing here to kind of break those silos down?
Well, I mean, I think the most obvious one is by combining the operational financial data. So pulling some of those like deeper metrics into the financial reporting, and putting that into the management and board pack is kind of obvious, but some people are not doing that. So I think that's obviously the first step, and then I guess going a bit further, it's looking at things like the sales pipeline. The sales pipeline data is really interesting, because you can use that to identify problem areas for marketing, or if you can compare your availability against your lead pipeline, but on a very granular basis. I'm not just talking about an aggregate number of workstations you've got available, offices you've got available versus the interest. Looking at matched availability and saying, okay, out of all of these products we have available, what matched interest do we have? And then using that to identify the problem areas, but also it can drive things like product decisions. So you might identify gaps in the kind of size of offices that you're delivering, or maybe you're not providing enough meeting room space or what have you. So I think linking up that data across functions is really important. Yeah.
And I think that final point is almost so obvious, but in a way so many people aren't looking at that, because now there are so many different ways of finding workspace, whether it's liquid space or other apps that are out there. The broker community has changed, and so our leads are coming from a whole kind of plethora of different systems. So making sure we understand which ones are working for our particular brand, our particular building, and matching that up with the actual inventory that's left to sell within a platform like Office R&D suddenly becomes kind of more important than ever before.
Yeah.
And if you get that right, you fill space quicker, means you don't have to spend quite as much money on marketing. And I think that's where, we're talking about silos, and that brings together kind of sales, marketing, and operations, and finance really quite neatly. So that's probably a good point to finish on. I guess we're out of time.
Thank you very much for the insightful thoughts. I have a couple of takeaways from your speech. And definitely there is no question that innovation and technology are a must and we need to follow. One thing that kind of caught my attention was that actually this is an ongoing process, and using innovation and technology is not a one-time thing, but it's a process of changing and adapting the way you work and the way you use technology. And a few things how to use technology here was actually running your space sustainably, optimizing and the usage of your spaces and services. Also providing your members with frictionless experience, and last but not least, enabling the generation of secondary revenue.